Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today, I am so pleased to be talking about Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. And I will admit, right from the top, I'm a little bit late to the Tom Lake party. Here's what happened. I picked up Tom Lake because, in fact, the cover was so appealing to me. And of course, everybody was enjoying this book. And I read the jacket copy, which sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And it just really did not appeal to me. It was something about, a mom telling a story of her past love to her 3 daughters in an orchard. Didn't really grab me. Only about a year later, when I learned from a friend that it had a lot to do with Our Town by Thornton Wilder, did I decide to go back and pick it up. I'm so happy I did, but I'm also really happy that I didn't read it until I fully appreciated its links with Our Town. Full confession, I did not see the play Our Town until I was well into my 40s, and in fact, I saw it at a high school production. This was a high school production that my youngest son was in. Otherwise, at that point in my life raising children, I was not a huge theater goer, as many of you can relate to. But I was so incredibly moved even by this high school production of Our Town. I will also say that our high school production was pretty amazing. The young woman who played Emily Webb just absolutely crushed me. It was so, so moving. And it made a huge impression on me. So I was really excited to read Tom Lake in the context of Our Town. And then it got even more exciting because I realized, in fact, that a lecture tying the two together was going to be really fun for me and hopefully interesting for you. Those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to get up to. We are going to do a very quick bio of Ann Patchett. We are going to look at the narrative stance of the book. We're going to look at the structure of Tom Lake. We're going to look at some intertexts, which are simply the books that Ann Patchett is referencing in Tom Lake. And this is a case when these books that are referenced in this book are incredibly important. And all throughout, as we are talking about Tom Lake, we will also be talking about where it has debts to Our Town. But then we're also going to take a special little section and talk about Our Town in relation to the novel. We're also going to take a quick look at The Cherry Orchard by Chekhov, very, very quick look, and the debts that the book has to the cherry orchard. We're then going to talk about some quibbles that I have. We'll then move to some of the real strengths of the book. And I'm very happy to say that today we're going to be closing with some words by Thornton Wilder. At the very end of Tom Lake, in a little note at the end, Ann Patchett is sort of exhorting her readers to go out and rediscover the works of Thornton Wilder. And so it was really gratifying for me not only to reread Our Town, which you can do in an hour. It was so moving. It was so, so good. It's really interesting to go back and read a play, especially this one because Thornton Wilder is very thorough in terms of stage direction, and the whole thing is very spare. So in lots of ways, it translates really well to a reading experience. It's just beautiful. But in my edition of Our Town, this edition right there, those of you on the YouTube can see, it has some different essays and some different things. And so we are going to close with some of the words by Thornton Wilder about his play and essentially about storytelling and imagination and the importance of this kind of work of art. Okay, super quick bio of Ann Patchett. She was born in 1963 in Los Angeles. That surprised me. I really picture her in Nashville. I picture her in Tennessee, I think, because she's been there for a long time. In fact, she moved there as a child. I kind of lump her in with people like Barbara Kingsolver and Louise Erdrich. I'm not even really sure why, but I sort of have those women as this kind of group of these wise women who write good literary fiction. Again, she was born in Los Angeles. Her father was a police chief. In Wikipedia, they make a big deal of the fact that he is the one who, in fact, arrested Charles Manson and Sirhan Sirhan, which, I mean, really, that would be actually kind of a big deal if your dad had done that. I don't know if she knows anything about it, but, there's the fact. Her mother was a nurse who actually became a novelist. Her parents got divorced when she was young. She is one of 2 children, and again, she moved to Nashville. She went to Sarah Lawrence, and while she was at Sarah Lawrence, published a short story that was in the Paris Review, which is a gigantic deal. For anyone who has ever tried to publish any fiction, including myself, to publish anything in the Paris Review, it's like the pinnacle of the pinnacle. It might be even a bigger deal than the New Yorker. So she did that while she was still at school. She went on to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which is another enormous accolade, like just an incredible thing to have done. and really, came out of the gates pretty strong. She worked at 17 magazine for a long time, for like 9 years, which for some reason I really liked that. I loved 17 magazine back in the day. Bel Canto came out in 2002. That was kind of the big book that put her on the map. I read Bel Canto when it came out in 2002. That was getting a lot of play, and I really did enjoy that book. But that was the time, it was the very end of my graduate school career. I was writing my dissertation, in fact, and I was pretty immersed in Latin American literature, like heavy-duty Latin American literature. So I think when I was reading Bel Canto, which is about a coup in Latin America, it fell a little bit short, just in terms of its depiction of what was going on, and also in terms of its literary stature. She's had a lot of success, and she's won a lot of prizes ever since then. She now runs Parnassus Books in Nashville. I think she has for quite a while. And I had to look up Parnassus because it was driving me crazy that I didn't remember what it was. It is a mountain in Greece where all of the muses live. So it seems like an incredibly good name. I also just like it. Okay, we're now going to dive into the work by looking at the cover art, the title, and the opening of the novel. But actually, before we do that, for those of you on the YouTube, you will notice, in fact, well, actually, you maybe haven't noticed yet, but now you will. I am wearing a top that has this beautiful little French ruffle. You can see it here, a nice little detail on the sleeve, and this beautiful seam around the collar. It's linen. It's beautifully done. The reason I'm saying that is because I made this top myself. Many of you who've been listening to the Foxed page for a long time know that I'm what I like to call a fiber artist, in fact. I do a lot of knitting, decent amount of needlepoint, and you all have been treated to many a sweater that I have knitted here on the Foxed page. As a child, I, very much like Laura in the novel, was a bit of a seamstress. I learned more from my mother than my grandmother, although my grandmother was also a real sewing influence for me. But I gave that up maybe the end of high school. I did head off to college in 1987 with a plaid jumper that I had made for myself, which was really, really something else. Didn't do a lot of sewing until recently when my younger sister inspired me. She literally has made all of her clothes. Her entire closet now is homemade, and everything is so gorgeous, and it is so beautiful and so well-fitting. So she's inspired me. This was the first thing I made, and I can tell you right now, it is a lot better than that jumper that I made in 1987. Okay, briefly talking about the cover art and the title. I say briefly because neither of these made a gigantic impact on me. I was very drawn to the cover, and I will stand by the fact that it is very appealing. My cover is the hardcover copy. It has these, this beautiful kind of greenish bluish field with lots of daisies on it. There's a simplicity to it and kind of a homespun feel, and it was very appealing to me. The title is one that I'm not super wild about. It's fine. I wish, in fact, it had a bit more sentiment. So there's a lot in this book, a lot of sense of place. There's a lot of stuff about New Hampshire, both in our town and also in Tom Lake. And there's a huge amount about Michigan. And all of that really resonated well with me. Tom Lake, it is the site in Michigan. And we have that nice little backstory, which for some reason reminded me of the cherry orchard, where we learn about this little boy who, in fact, is relatively entitled, and his babysitter tells him all about how the lake is his and everything else is his and the whole world is his. And so first it was Tom's Lake, and then it became Tom Lake. So I liked that ish, and it did seem like kind of a nod to Chekhov, but those ties were not quite tight enough for me to feel like the backstory of Tom Lake was compelling enough. So the title was fine. It did interest me too, because at first I thought it was a name. I thought this was a person, and that was fine. So I give the title like a B minus. We then move on to the dedication. It is dedicated to Kate DiCamillo. I don't know her work well. The thing that I remember her writing is Tales of Despero, which was a book that I purchased for one of my children who was not a big reader. And in fact, that book did not sway my children to become a big reader, although by all accounts, it's an amazing children's book. Ann Patchett, I think, recently has published her first children's book, so I imagine she's maybe inspired by Kate DiCamillo. But I did like this idea of for Kate DiCamillo, who held the lantern high. So, I like this. I like the image. I like the image of it. Okay, we are now going to dive in to the first paragraph of the novel. That Veronica and I were given keys and told to come early on a frozen Saturday in April to open the school for the Our Town auditions was proof of our dull reliability. The play's director, Mr. Martin, was my grandmother's friend and State Farm agent. That's how I was wrangled in, through my grandmother, and Veronica was wrangled because we did pretty much everything together. Citizens of New Hampshire could not get enough of Our Town. We felt about the play the way other Americans felt about the Constitution or the Star-Spangled Banner. It spoke to us, made us feel special and seen. Mr. Martin predicted a large turnout for the auditions, which explained why he needed use of the school gym for the day. The community theater production had nothing to do with our high school, but seeing as how Mr. Martin was also the principal's insurance agent and very likely his friend, the request was granted. Ours was that kind of town. This is so gorgeous. It's such a beautiful beginning. It's quiet, but it's very intimate, and it speaks so well to the kind of mundane, but also very sweet tone of so much of the novel. I also like the idea that this last sentence, the last sentence of any paragraph, is very important. It sort of lingers in your mind, and all of the energy of the paragraph is building toward this last sentence. And we have this very brief sentence, which reads, "Ours was that kind of town." So this is kind of cueing you to the fact at the beginning that not only do we have our town, she states the production there, but that also it has to do, with their town, that they really feel it. I will admit that I did not remember that our town takes place in New Hampshire. So it took me a bit here to understand why, in fact, the citizens of New Hampshire are so invested and feel so special. But having read the play now and having finished the novel, I fully appreciate the way that you would feel kind of chosen as this kind of archetypal representative of Americans, given the success of Thornton Wilder's play and sort of the expanse of it. I mean, he's really speaking not only to all Americans, but it is a play that gets so vast. At different times, he's talking about geological time, and there's lots of stuff about the cosmos and sort of New Hampshire. It's very expansive in many ways. And so I think if you were from New Hampshire, you would, in fact, feel very flattered by this. There are also a couple of very important aspects here. We have a first-person narration, which we're going to talk about in a bit. We also have the grandmother as really taking an important role at the beginning, and that will continue. I also loved the fact that the small town, you get the feel of it right away by the fact that her grandmother's friend and State Farm agent is the one who got young Laura kind of roped into this whole thing. But even the idea of State Farm, you have this idea of a small town insurance salesman, but you also have the word farm in there. So you have this idea of kind of American security, but also the precariousness. I mean, the idea of having an insurance man to begin with speaks of ill, and it speaks of risk, and it speaks of trying to stave off any kind of disaster. So you have these intimations from the very beginning of the complexity that we see both in the novel and in the play. Also, in retrospect, it's always so interesting to go back and look at a first paragraph after I have finished a book. But this idea of the community theater as being distinct from the high school theater program, and the fact that these are all, aspiring actors, not high school students who are auditioning, is important. One of the things that this book does well and that I really enjoyed was that it really, no pun intended, really pulled back the curtain on theater life. You heard the word summer stock. For some reason, I associate summer stock with Salinger. But you have this, this kind of fabled idea of summer stock. And it only recently occurred to me that there is this giant system of all of these theaters across the nation, these smaller repertory theaters, where they are premiering plays, putting up other plays that are more well-known. And then these regional plays will make their way, off Broadway and hope to sort of move further and further toward Broadway. So I really enjoyed right from the beginning that we have this idea of the importance of community theater. I mean, this one in New Hampshire is not particularly important, but in fact, it does lead to Laura being discovered. So you have this real sense of this system of theaters and how this is all working. So we're going to take a minute here and talk about the narrative stance. Narrative stance is a very cool way. I realize we do this almost every single lecture. It's a really great way to understand really important fundamentals about any work. And here it's really important in ways that I think are a little bit sneaky. So I'm going to read the first sentence of the second paragraph just to remind you of this first person perspective. And in fact, here we have the first person plural, we, and then we have the first person singular, I. This is our narrator talking about herself and Veronica. We arrived with our travel mugs of coffee and thick paperback novels. Firestarter for Veronica and Dr. Zhivago for me. I liked school fine, but hated the gym and everything it stood for. A little further down. But on that Saturday morning, the place was empty and strangely beautiful. We're going to talk about the importance of these intertexts. Here we have Firestarter and Dr. Zhivago right at the start, which of course are telling you everything you need to know about Veronica, who's reading, Stephen King and who's kind of a Firestarter herself. And then, Lara, who's reading Dr. Zhivago, who is all about vast romantic stories and these wide open spaces, very much like Pasternak talking about in Russia. But what's important here again is this first person narrator. So first person is tricky because it is obviously fairly limited. If you are telling the story from a perspective of I, then that person, like Lara, really is only privy to a certain amount of information. But in many ways, that works really well here. And first person narration does work really well when you actually want that feeling of a narrator whose experience is limited and whose knowledge is limited. So in this case, we have Lara, who has this information and has this memory about her backstory. And what is important is when we realize that she is telling her girls a story that only she knows, and one where she is deciding which elements to share and how to mete out the information, how to omit certain things and to include other things. So it's actually very logical and very powerful that we have this first person narrator. She is enlightening her daughters as to this truth that is very important. And not only is she withholding important information from her daughters, but also from the reader, which is really delicious in lots of ways. You also get the sense that she herself and her husband are discovering how this story from the past, which is very much their origin story, is inflecting their everyday life. I also like the fact that Ann Patchett does a very good job of only giving us information that, in fact, Lara would be privy to. So the classic example of a more expansive first-person narrator is someone like Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. There are parts of that book that Nick Carraway could have no access to. And there's some different ways that Fitzgerald is trying to sort of convince us of different ways that he might have that information. But in this case, Ann Patchett is very tight and very limited and very logical about what it is that Lara is telling us. And it's just a very beautifully done first-person narrative. So you have this limitation that is inherent in first-person narration, but you also have this intimacy. And I found this book, very kind of sweet and quiet until the third act when things get very dark in many ways, just like in Our Town. But I think that some of that intimacy and some of that kind of sweetness comes from this first-person narrator having intimacy. You can imagine that anytime you have a first-person narrator, whenever a novel is saying, I did this and I did that, there is an assumed you. So the reader is that you. It's I am telling you a story. I, Lara / Ann Patchett, am telling you, the reader, a story. There's a lot of intimacy there that lots of times is sort of, subliminal. We're not really thinking about the fact that this feels more intimate than an omniscient third person narrator who's telling us he did that and she did that. The I did this and I did that is really moving in some very basic ways. And I think Ann Patchett does a very good job of using it here. One of the ways that she does it best is when she uses something called direct address. So this is when a first-person narrator will use the imperative grammatically in order to tell the reader to do something. And it's some of these times when you feel the narrator and the narrator's connection to the reader most acutely. So if we look on page 48, we have the girls talking to their mother, Lara, and then there's a space break, which are used to very good effect. We also have this thing, and I really enjoyed this. The space breaks are pretty standard, like when we're moving from the past to the present or vice versa. You have a nice space break, so things are very clear to the reader. You also have this double indentation, which I really like. That's just a stylistic choice. It's not like a big deal, but it really was appealing to me. So we also have some italics at the beginning of each of the sections. So I like the fact that there's a very clear break in lots of ways. I also found that this kind of playing with the typeface, having it be in italics, and also this double indentation at the top of each section made me think a little bit of reading a play, in the sense that there's a lot of structure to how a play is formatted. That's very standard. You'll have stage direction in italics, maybe. You'll have, all the names of the people speaking, obviously, are on the left side. You have a colon, then you have their lines. There are lots of sort of prescribed ways that people understand a script. And so, this is not even close to a script, but I really appreciated the fact that they did some typesetting stuff that's a little different than a normal novel. And I thought it worked really well. So we have, she's talking to her daughters. Then we have a space break, and we have this. Go back to New Hampshire to Bill Ripley sitting in that darkened university theater beside his sister. So here we have, this is a direct address. This is direct address, and it's also an imperative. She's saying, go back to New Hampshire. And she's saying it to the reader. She's saying it to you, the reader. And you may not have gotten quite the frisson that I got when I read that, but every time there's a direct address, I'm always like, oh my God. And especially if it's imperative, because I'm like, okay, here I go. I'm going back to New Hampshire and Bill Ripley. But it's this very powerful thing. And also, this is one of the ways that she's not expanding beyond the experience of Lara, but when she's not saying, I was sitting next to Bill Ripley, it's a very elegant way of sort of taking Lara a little bit out of the scenario, a little bit out of the equation, by simply saying to the reader, go back to New Hampshire to Bill Ripley sitting in that darkened university theater beside his sister. So it's this very intricate and I think very effective use of the first person that really has a lot to do with the quiet sweetness of the novel and how invested we are in all of these different characters. And my last comment about the first-person narration is perhaps the most important, which is this. Our first-person narrator in this novel is in fact mirroring the stage director who we have in our town. Sorry, not stage director, stage manager. We have this stage manager who is in fact narrating. It's a spoken play. He's narrating the action and he's telling us a lot of really important information, a lot of the kind of connective tissue that we need as theater goers both to understand and to be moved. I would argue, in fact, that this first-person narrator, that Lara, the way that she is explaining everything, and both giving us scenes, very much like the stage manager would be doing. He'll speak about something and then he'll sort of step aside and let the scene unfold. That is very much the way that Lara is doing things. She sort of sets things in motion and then in fact lets dialogue and lets description take over as the scene unfolds. So I would argue that this first-person narration, I mean, I'm not even sure that Anne Patchett had to do a lot of thinking about it. Often these things are very natural and grow organically out of the story. But I do think it's very well done, in part because it does echo the stage manager. Okay, we're going to move on now to talk about the structure. So this first-person narration works in part really well because of this structure. I mentioned that we have, this sort of front story and this back story. And it's interesting because often the front story is kind of the contemporary moment, the moment that is happening as the story is being told, and the backstory is like whatever has happened in the past. But Patchett here is turning that a little bit on its head, and I love that because, in fact, her past, her high school and her college and her early adulthood, that ends up feeling a little bit like the front story. Her past is far more important than what is going on in the front story. I mean, it's not far more important, but in many ways, we would not have this novel if we, in fact, did not have her history. And I like that because it ends up making it feel like we have kind of equal weight, that we're equally interested in both. So we're going to take a look on page 9 at this structure. We're going to look at it a little closely because it's doing so many different things. And these are things that as a reader, you're probably not even that cognizant of, but it's really cool to understand why this structure works so well and what in fact it's doing, in your brain that is making the story so compelling. So on page 9, we have, in her late high school days, we have Lara explaining something like this. If you wonder where the decency is in alterations, I can tell you. My grandmother. She was both a seamstress and a fountain of human decency. And then a little further down. My grandmother, who always had a yellow tape measure hanging around her neck and a pin cushion held to her wrist with a strip of elastic. The pin cushion corsage, I called it. Quick note on the pincushion corsage. I came home from my sister's. I was in a sewing trance over there with her. We sewed all day. And I came home and I had just like a couple more things I needed to do. And I was wearing my pincushion corsage and it is so amazing. It looks like a little pumpkin. It's corduroy. It is so cute. And my husband was making so much fun of me. If you're on the YouTube, maybe I'll just like post up a little chunk of that video.
What is that?
It's a pincushion. This is just the beginning. The beginning of it all. He was trying to make fun of me. He put it in the family chat, and thank God my children did not think it was goofy. They, in fact, really thought that my pincushion corsage was amazing. Back to the story here, though. We have this description of her talking about her grandmother as this fountain of human decency, which is very important. It's very like Grover's Corner. It's very like Thornton Wilder to talk about someone who is in New Hampshire, who is like this very kind of decent person. In many ways, this is getting back to the importance of community and domesticity and sewing and kind of an older way of doing things. So we have that. And then we have this final paragraph in the section that is from her childhood, from her high school days. Watching these men recite the same lines so badly while polishing their glasses with giant white handkerchiefs really made me think about my life. So I did have a little quibble there. I'm not entirely sure that that last sentence is necessary. I think maybe what seemed a little bit overdone to me was this idea of that these men auditioning really made me think about my life. It seemed a little bit overstated. But so that is the end of the first section. We have her ending with this big statement about thinking about her life. And then we have a space break, and we have that beautiful thing I was talking about with the double indentation of the paragraph and then the italics. And we have this. Wait. You wanted to be a vet? Maisie shakes her head. You never wanted to be a vet. You never said that before. Maisie will begin her 3rd year of veterinary school in the fall. If, in fact, there is school in the fall. I did for a while. You know how it is in high school. You wanted to be a pediatrician in high school, Nell says to her sister in my defense. Could someone explain to me what any of that has to do with Peter Duke? Emily asks. My girls have directed me to start the story at the beginning. So we have this incredibly satisfying jump where we have, Veronica with her fire starter and Lara with her Dr. Zhivago, and they're in this audition. And then we have this jump, and out of nowhere, we have this, wait, you wanted to be a vet? And we are introduced in very quick succession, a quarter of a page, to Maisie, Nell, and Emily. And even if you don't know Our Town, you would have gathered in the last few pages that Emily is the star of Our Town. So it's very satisfying here to see Emily as the name of their eldest child. And then, of course, we go on to find out that Nell and Maisie are also important names. But right away, we're introduced to this concept of these 3 daughters and the simple idea that their mother is telling them this story. Also, right from the beginning, we have this idea of the girls as having certain opinions and certain impressions of their mother, and in fact, their mother kind of working against some of their preconceived notions about their mother. This is also introducing the idea of King Lear. If you have 3 daughters pretty much anywhere, you should be thinking a little bit about King Lear, who is, the aging Shakespearean king who has his 3 daughters. And you should be thinking about legacy, and you should be thinking about older people, losing their power, and you should be thinking about succession and women and girls and girl power. So this is a very kind of heavy Lear kind of moment. And in fact, King Lear comes up twice at different points in the play. But it's also doing this other very cool thing where right from the start, this structure allows us this cool idea where we hear in the beginning, in the sort of high school era, that she maybe wanted to be a vet, maybe wanted to be in the Peace Corps. And it's so satisfying because we know as readers that we have all of the answers in the front story. Here I'm using front story as the contemporary moment. When she is an older woman in Michigan with her 3 daughters, we know, in fact, that she has not become a veterinarian. And we know, in fact, at one point she wanted to be a teacher. She's not a teacher. Maybe she went to the Peace Corps, but we don't really have that sense. So there's this very satisfying thing where you're going to hear a lot of questions in Lara's youth, but you'll have the satisfaction when you jump into the future. You'll have all of those questions answered. The other thing very quickly that comes up here, you have this very subtle thing here where she says, if there are classes in the fall. There are a lot of really subtle references to COVID in this novel. I really thought this was one of the best COVID novels I have read. Unsurprisingly, it is not being billed as a COVID novel, because in fact, COVID is very subtle, but it's really important. I mean, this is the whole reason these girls are here. It's the whole reason I think in many ways why their focus is fairly pessimistic about the future. I mean, of course, it's environmental concerns that they're mainly fixated on, but you have this idea of global pandemic. And it is interesting in these kind of subtle, not beating you over the head ways, just to remember how families were united or not united, and how strange that time was, and how limited things like weddings became and college, and how different people had such different experiences of the whole era. So, and I want to look very quickly at a couple of other things that are happening here, which is that we have this setting right from the start of these people going about their domestic lives on the farm. And the reason I mention that is it's a cherry orchard, and she talks at a couple of points about Eden and how she would like to give her daughters Eden. So anytime you come across an orchard or an apple tree, or really any fruit tree in literature, you should think of Eden, and you should think of the Garden of Eden, and you should think of Adam and Eve, and you should think of the tree of knowledge, and you should think about whether or not the characters are eating of the fruit of knowledge. And by that, I mean metaphorically, whether they are recognizing, that they are naked and they are having shame and they're doing sort of that cardinal sin. I thought it was excellent that Ann Patchett is talking about bestowing knowledge upon her girls. In this case, it is, her own romantic history, which is very like Edenic in some ways. And it's about her sexual awakening. So I think that the idea of having this happen in an orchard is really very apt. And then I actually thought it was funny that it was happening in a cherry orchard because of, that super outdated idea about, virginity, which I'm totally down on virginity as a concept at all. And I am certainly down on the idea of like talking about a girl's virginity as her cherry, which, oh my God, I can't even believe I'm saying that. It just sounds so terrible as I'm saying it. But it was something that occurred to me. So you have all of that inherent here. You have the Lear idea, you have the idea of this Edenic setting, you have the idea of knowledge, you have the idea of sexual awakening, but you also have this incredibly kind of intense but mundane domestic thing that they're all doing. Well, it's this picking of the cherries, this harvesting, which is very much like what is happening in one of the sort of elements in Our Town, the play, which is that the women are sitting on the porches and they are putting up their green beans for the winter time. So you have this idea of them as preparing the harvest and doing, what they can with a surplus, very much, in fact, like these people in Tom Lake are doing with their cherries. Before we leave this idea of structure, I want to take a look at a couple of different ways that are really different, but where the structure really enables very cool things that are happening in the novel. On page 18, we have a bunch of Laura's past being told, and then we have a space break, and we have this. I look at my watch. It's easy to forget how late it is because the sun stays up forever in the summer. We're switching to montage now, I tell the girls. I won't put you through any more of high school. So I loved this because as the reader, you're also like, okay, good. Like I've had enough high school. This is great. I'm happy to move on to the next thing. And I like the idea of like, we're switching to montage. You have the sense of Laura on page 18 as being someone who can really handle a story. And in terms of pacing, so pacing is just, the speed and the way in which information is meted out over the course of a narrative. The pacing is really good here. We had, plenty of high school, and then she's like, okay, we're moving to montage. I'm going to give you a quick, zip through college, and then, well, not exactly, but then we're going to get to the kind of juicy part, which is where we are actually at Tom Lake. So I like the signpost to the reader, which is like, don't worry, this backstory is not going to go on forever. We're going to make some jumps as we move along. And also this kind of slightly meta thing where she's like, okay, I'm going to, move us into this kind of montage thing, which is very much like a screenplay or very much like a play. And in fact, in Our Town, there are different parts where he's the stage manager is describing things instead of having them acted out, which ends up feeling sort of like a montage as well. We're going to look at page 95. And this I loved. This was such a cool thing that the structure enables. And what we have here is this incredible juxtaposition. So we have the beginning of Laura's relationship with Peter Duke. It's starting to unfold. In fact, this is when they're very first going up to her bedroom. So on page 95, we have this final sentences, a couple sentences in this section on her time with Peter Duke. That we were walking up the stairs holding hands seemed like the most natural thing in the world. For all I knew, he had gone upstairs with the other Emily as well, the one who'd lasted only a day. He may have been taking me back to a bed he'd already slept in, and I couldn't have cared less because it was my bed now. Then we have a space break. This is odd, Joe says when he comes in the back door. I couldn't believe it. It's so excellent because here she is heading upstairs with Peter Duke, and she's about to have this kind of amazing sexual experience with this person who's this very magnetic, dynamic actor type. So we were sort of waiting for them to have their sexual experience. And right then, as they're sort of preparing for whatever is going to happen in their bed, we have the space break and her husband says, "This is odd." And then he comes in the back door. I mean, the back door thing, I don't think she's trying to make a reference to sex in that position at this point. But it is kind of funny because it is somewhat sexualized. But I loved the idea of her describing this incipient relationship she's about to have. And then her husband saying, "This is odd." It's so good. And it really is only this structure, the way that the reader is prepared for this back and forth, that allows us to have that kind of juxtaposition where the past, she's thinking about Peter Duke and how much she loved this guy. And then suddenly her husband is like in her reality, which is exactly how these kinds of things work. Meaning that, you can be lost in thought about something and then have somebody come in and have it be a very inappropriate thing. I mean, thank God people cannot read each other's minds. Okay, and then moving on just a little bit further. So one of the things that happened with the pacing, and this has to do with the structure as well, is I did start feeling a little bit like it was getting a little bit sweet. It seemed like, okay, this is this kind of sweet love story. And I started thinking, I'm not someone who's invested in plot particularly, but I was like, is this just going to continue on being this kind of sweet story? But so we have this statement on page 97. So we're sort of like 1/3 in. And already I'm starting to sort of think like, okay, this kind of sweet love story is getting a little bit old, meaning her, the sweetness in it is the fact that she's so devoted to her husband, Joe. So on page 97, we have this. For so many years I have kissed him. For so many years I have not kissed another soul. And there is a deep and abiding comfort in this. Joe is not Duke. Joe was never Duke, and I would never have wanted him to be. So that kind of statement happens over and over. And as the reader, you're like, okay, I get it. But like in the end of the story, we assume she is still with her husband, Joe. So you're a little bit like, where is the tension here? And this was one time where rereading Our Town was really helpful for me. So there are 3 acts in Our Town. The first is called Daily Life. The second is called Love and Marriage. And then the stage manager says of the 3rd act, I reckon you can guess what that's about. So in fact, he's alluding to mortality and death. But it was very helpful to know that we're going to have this kind of daily life thing, and then we're going to have a big chunk that is about love and marriage. And in fact, Patchett is offering this really beautiful kind of amalgam of both passionate love from when she was little and this kind of mature love in her marriage. I did think a little bit like, okay, I think that we should move on to something a little more exciting, which sounds so kind of cynical. And there was plenty of stuff happening in the backstory, but because you know how it's going to end, there were times where it felt a little, it felt like, she was kind of stepping on her punchline. It felt a little anticlimactic. It also felt like there were lots and lots of times where we heard this same thing, like, oh, there was all of this passion with Peter, but in fact, Joe is the one for me. We're going to move on and look at one last thing that the structure enables that is so cool. And this is on page 247. This is an example of something called dramatic irony. So dramatic irony is simply when the readers, and it happens a lot actually in plays that are put on in the theater. In fact, it's kind of like the main thing that plays do, but it's this thing that where the reader or the audience knows information that the characters do not. It happens all the time. It sounds kind of convoluted, but it's actually very simple. So on 247, we have a conversation. We're late in the novel. We have a conversation between Sebastian and Laura, and they're getting together, in their youth for the first time in a long time, and they're talking about the people they used to be with. Sebastian was with Pallas, and of course Laura was with Peter Duke. So Sebastian starts. He's saying that Pallas told him not to come up and watch her because she was so busy. I really wanted to see her in Our Town again, even if it meant driving up and turning around to drive right back after the show. It would have been a lot. Joe did it. Joe Nelson. I hadn't said goodbye to him after the last performance. I forgot that I wasn't going to see him again. There's the dramatic irony. So we know, in fact, that Laura is going to go on to marry Joe Nelson. And we have this moment here where Sebastian brings him up, and it's almost like our narrator has totally forgotten who this guy is. And as a reader, it's very satisfying because you're like, oh my gosh, she almost like forgot who this Joe Nelson was, and she didn't bother saying goodbye to him. And we know that they're going to end up being married. And in fact, at page 247, we have a good idea of like how this is all going to happen. But it's this very satisfying thing where we as readers know, and when she's surprised, we're not surprised with her because we are very familiar with the story, but you have this kind of thing like, oh my gosh, what if she hadn't remembered? Or what if they hadn't ended up together? It's very satisfying. And the reason why it functions, why we can have this kind of dramatic irony, is in fact because of this amazing structure. It's a very simple structure in many ways, but Anne Patchett uses it so deftly. So now we're going to move on and do a brief thing where I'm going to talk a little bit about the play, Our Town. and the ways that it is interacting with Tom Lake. So you're all probably familiar with the idea of the play within the play, which is a Shakespearean idea where anytime there is a text within a text, so, there will be a play, like in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's an important play that is happening that all of the characters are putting on inside the play. So you often also will have like a novel within a novel or a play inside a novel. But in this case, it seemed extra important because we have this novel and then we have the play within the novel. So we have them putting on Our Town. The front story, the novel, is inflected by all sorts of different elements of the play, if that makes sense. And it's not just Our Town. I wanted to just kind of quickly whip through a few of these things. And again, say that I think there's a little more importance put on these titles than usual because, in fact, this is a book where the play within the book is really important. So, of course, we have the dedication to Kate DiCamillo. Then we have Firestarter, of course, which is a Stephen King book. We have Dr. Zhivago, which is that Pasternak, very, big Russian romantic book. And right at the beginning, when we have Veronica in high school, with Lara, we have Veronica having this quotation of Shakespeare, which is all the world's a stage. So you have these ideas from the beginning, not only that we are, in a theater kind of milieu, but also that we are really hearkening on some big titles like Shakespeare. We then have Lara a bit later talking about Prometheus, which is, of course, that idea of, he's the god who gave man fire. And then he was stuck on that rock. And every day the eagle or whatever would come and eat out his liver. And then it would grow back and it would happen day after day after day. So it's the idea of someone who's punished. And of course, we have lots of books about Prometheus being unbound and, being freed from the rock. Then we have 2 references to the cherry orchard, which is very kind of on the nose in some ways because this entire book is set on a cherry orchard. So just very quickly, this is a very important Chekhov play, and that may be kind of the most important thing about it. In the cherry orchard, there's this aristocratic woman who, the aristocracy is in its decline in Russia, and she goes back to the family's, vast acreage of farms and is going to sell off the farm in order to pay the mortgage either on the farm or her house or her castle or whatever it is that the aristocracy had to be getting rid of at the time. So she sells it to one of the former serfs. And as they're leaving, they hear the sound of the entire forest being chopped down or razed in some way. I don't know. This, by the way, is literally the Wikipedia summary. I have not read a ton of Chekhov. I've read more of his fiction than I have of his plays. Although there was a production of The Seagull a while ago. It was a movie production of The Seagull that I loved. I don't even remember who was in it, but it was so, so moving, which does speak to both the idea of the actual cherry farm in Michigan that Tom, oh my gosh, this whole time I've been saying Tom, it's Joe, that Tom is going to inherit and Lara is going to live on, but it also has to do with the succession and the idea of Peter Duke as being very successful, but his life as being largely feudal. We have a couple of different references to Lear, which is, again, obviously a very large Shakespeare play. And, it has everything to do, a lot of actually the same themes as we have in Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. It has to do with land. It has to do with inheritance. It has to do with men losing power and succession and women taking power or not being able to take power. So you have these very large plays that are in the audience or the reader's consciousness as we are moving through the work. We also have a bunch of references to cabaret, and that is important because in many ways this book is about sexual awakening and sexual desire, and cabaret is certainly a play that is very concerned with sexual desire. I don't know anything about the play that Lara is in later with Peter Duke, the one where he is really digging into his alcoholic tendencies, and she is just really not good in it because it turns out she can only really be Emily. That's the only thing that she can act. And I probably should know more about that other play because it is a very important play within a play. But at this moment, I can't even remember its title. So the point that I would make about all of those intertexts is that each one of them is important in terms of inflecting the play and allowing us to think a little bit differently about Tom Lake. But maybe the most important thing is one thing that Ann Patchett is doing by including people like Chekhov and people like Shakespeare and having them kind of in the same class as Thornton Wilder is this real elevation of the play. So we know from the afterword, and we know simply, from this book itself, that Ann Patchett is a real believer in the importance and the value of Thornton Wilder. And one way to kind of really drive that home is to put Thornton Wilder in the company of Shakespeare and Chekhov, and also like Stephen King, but like also like the Greek myths and really seminal plays like Cabaret. So it's this musicals like Cabaret. So it's this very cool thing where she is both allowing the reader to kind of enhance their experience with these plays, but also really elevating Our Town. So that's actually a very good segue into one of the main questions that I had while I was reading this text, which is I made a conscious decision to not read Our Town until I was done, because my sense is that a lot of readers who are reading Tom Lake either haven't seen Our Town at all, or they maybe saw it like I did one time in a high school production, or, maybe these are real lovers of Our Town who know the play inside and out. And if you are that person who really is familiar with the play, I certainly think you would get more out of this reading. What I tried to do as someone who didn't remember a lot from Our Town, except that it was desperately sad, I was also so taken by the idea that all of the action is mimed, which was this incredibly innovative thing that Thornton Wilder did. And I was so impressed. It's like very difficult to do, and their whole miming classes as an actor. And I remember being so impressed with these high school students who were doing it so incredibly well. But one of my main questions is like, okay, if the only things I remember about this play is that it's sad and that it's mimed, I didn't really remember the contents of it. That like, how was the reading of Tom Lake going to be for me? And the fact is, Ann Patchett is really giving us a lot about what the story is about. We have snippets here and there that are taken directly from the text. We have the idea that Emily's relationship with her father is really important, which I don't think people talk about that enough. I think it's a little bit weird. There is a very strong connection between them. Maybe it's because I'm not like a daddy's girl in any way. But I was a little bit like, wow, she is really, there is really a very large investment here on the father-daughter relationship in a way that I was a little bit surprised by. But we have a sense of what Our Town is all about. So even if you never read it, I think that Ann Patchett does give us enough to understand the elements that are truly important. But I will tell you that if you have read it, or even if you go to read Our Town after you have finished Tom Lake, it is so rewarding. I found it so, so beautiful. I'm not like dying to go back and reread Tom Lake with Our Town in mind. It's not quite like that kind of a book. Tom Lake isn't. But Our Town was so gorgeous. And I do think that having Tom Lake in mind, I'm picturing Peter Duke, the kind of tragic, dynamic Peter Duke, in these different roles. And I'm picturing Joe as the stage manager. It was like a very beautiful way to then go and read Thornton Wilder. But the thing I will tell you is that it is such a gorgeous piece of literature, and it's innovative and interesting and quick, but also just incredibly moving and vast and sort of timeless. So I'm joining Ann Patchett here and saying that everybody should re-recognize the genius of Thornton Wilder. I'm also, though, I have to say, not like zipping out to read all of his novels right now. I think this was perfect. My dip into Thornton Wilder amounted just to Our Town, and that was perfect. I do, though, want to talk about some of the ways that I think the play really does have an impact on the novel, and these are aspects that I think might deepen your appreciation of Tom Lake. So one, of course, is this idea of the first-person narration, Lara speaking, which is very much like the stage manager. You can imagine that if it were an omniscient narrator saying, like, Lara did this, and Peter did that, and Nell did this, and Maisie did that. I think Maisie's actually the dog. No, Hazel is the dog. Maisie is the girl. But that would be a very different thing than sort of the intimacy that we have with Lara. There's also an intimacy in knowing that the stage manager was read by Joe. It's Joe Nelson. Every time I said Tom, I was like, I don't think that's quite right. And in fact, it is Joe Nelson. Whoops, sorry. So there's that aspect of the narration. We also have this idea throughout of Mr. Stimson, who is this tragic character because, in fact, he has issues with alcohol use. And in many ways, if you knew that one of the kind of most sad and kind of most tragic characters in Our Town is someone who cannot drink alcohol, then you have an appreciation, I think, for Peter Duke as this kind of alcoholic. Not only Peter Duke, but also the stage manager as being people who are really victims of alcoholism. And it's writ kind of very large in a way that in Our Town it's very quiet, but it really does have kind of a lot of gravity in the play. And so you understand, or it sort of magnifies the tragedy of the drinking habits on the part of both the stage manager and Peter Duke. We also have this incredible quote at one point on the part of the stage manager. It's on page 59, so sort of halfway through, where he says, "I'm awfully interested in how big things like that begin." So he, in that case, is talking, they sort of come to a part where they're announcing that Emily and George are going to get married, and then we go back and someone tells us about it. So this idea that in Our Town, we hear about their marriage first, and then someone goes back and tells us about it is very much like the structure in Tom Lake, where Lara, we know, in fact, that Joe Nelson and Lara are going to be married, but we don't know how it began. And that is sort of one of the biggest questions in Tom Lake. And we have the same sort of form in Our Town, where we know they're going to get married, and then we go back and hear about the story. We also have a graveyard is super important in Act 3. So in Act 3, you suddenly come back onto the stage after the intermission, and there are all of these people sitting quietly in these chairs, and they represent the graveyard. And it's so startling because there are lots of people in there, including Emily, and you don't know how they died, and it's very sudden, and it sort of imitates that idea of how shocking their deaths would have been. It's a really incredible way to represent the sadness and the smallness and the short span of human life. And then there's this beautiful description in Our Town of the way that the graveyard is situated in the town. It's up high on this beautiful spot, and it looks out, and it has this beautiful vista from there. And there's a thing about how, everyone else in the country, at least from New York, should come up and see how beautiful New Hampshire is and how lucky all of these people of Grover's Corner are to be buried here. And that idea of the sort of primacy, the beauty of the graveyard is absolutely something that we see in Tom Lake. It is something that Peter Duke is drawn to. It's something that the girls are drawn to. And in fact, that is the site of all of the daisies that we see in the novel, and they come up again and again, but also on the beautiful cover of the book that was so appealing to me. We also have this idea of that is really beautifully done in both Our Town and Tom Lake, where in Our Town, there's a lot of reminders of the vastness of the world as compared to Grover's Corner. So I want to read just a couple of things from Our Town, in part because it's just really fun to hear Thornton Wilder's actual words. So in this case, the narrator, who is the stage manager, is asking Professor Willard to speak. And Professor Willard, who is one of the townspeople in Our Town, says the following. Grover's Corner, let me see. Grover's Corner lies on the old Pleistocene granite of the Appalachian Range. I may say it's some of the oldest land in the world. We're very proud of that. A shelf of Devonian basalt crosses it with vestiges of Mesozoic shale and some sandstone outcroppings, but that's all more recent, 200, 300 million years ago. So you have this beautiful idea of geologic time. I mean, he's like, okay, this happened, at one point, and then more recently, 200 or 300 million years ago. So you have this vastness of time, which is such a beautiful way of showing how very, very short the human lifespan is. And there are lots of things that Peter Duke stands for, but one of them is, of course, this idea of life as being very short. Then on page 21, we actually have kind of a difficult description of the anthropological history of the town. Yes, anthropological data. Early Amerindian stock, Cotahatchee tribes, no evidence before the 10th century of this era. Now entirely disappeared. Possible traces in 3 families. Migration toward the end of the 17th century of English brachiocephalic blue-eyed stock for the most part. Some of them Slav and Mediterranean. So we have this very succinct and in some ways very haunting description here. We have the idea of the Amerindian people, so like American Indian, and the Cotahatchee tribes, and then this idea of now entirely disappeared, which is so difficult, and this idea of possible traces in 3 families is really speaking to this idea of the loss of the indigenous people. And then when we have migration toward the end of the 17th century of English brachiocephalic blue-eyed stock, you have this idea here of the very recent immigration of all of the white people. And then the idea of the Slav and Mediterranean is speaking, in fact, to some of the, there's a lot of talk about Polish town in the novel. So you're talking about conflicts among human beings, whether that's the indigenous people with the incoming English and their terrible genocide. And then you have this idea of the Slavic and the Mediterranean coming in and all sorts of different stratification in society and how difficult that would be. And part of the beauty of this idea of this geologic time is the way that Ann Patchett is bringing up climate change in Tom Lake. So you have this idea of looking at the Earth as this very old, entity that has to do with the ground, and it has to do with minerals, and then the idea of human beings and essentially the terror that human beings have wrought on this earth. So I think it's a really beautiful way, if you have read Our Town recently, to acknowledge, when Ann Patchett is talking about climate change, which is a very, it's a fairly large strain in the novel, you can see that it has, sort of the germ of it is in fact in Our Town. And very much the way that the geologic time led to the idea of climate change in Tom Lake, we have this idea, I think, of these different ethnicities of people and these different strifes between humans. We have this very optimistic thing in 1988 where you have a theater group that is in fact very diverse. That was in fact one of my quibbles, because I was a little bit like, wait, in 1988, would this kind of diversity have been, just accepted so freely? I like to think that Ann Patchett is correct, but part of me does wonder whether or not that would have been happening in 1988. And the last thing I want to look at from Our Town, again, speaking to the vastness of human experience and the way that the human lifespan is so small, which is one thing, in fact, that Tom Lake is really picking up for us, is this idea of time passing. And that is something that we feel in Tom Lake, certainly when we have, the whole entire lifespan of Peter Duke, being sort of condensed into this one tale that a woman is telling to her daughters. We have sort of inklings of that in Our Town. So on page 30, we have the stage manager talking about essentially a time capsule. They've asked a friend of mine what they should put in the cornerstone for people to dig up 1,000 years from now. And then he goes down a little bit further. Babylon once had 2 million people in it, and all we know about them is the names of kings and some copies of wheat contracts. And contracts for the sale of slaves. So here again, we have Thornton Wilder really pointing out, I think, some of the ways that humans have failed each other. And then a little further down, so I'm going to have a copy of this play put in the cornerstone, and the people 1,000 years from now will know a few simple facts about us, more than the Treaty of Versailles and the Lindenberg flight. So I love this. And what this is speaking to, this idea of Our Town, the kind of smallness and the sweetness of it and the quietness of it, this idea of very common people doing very mundane things, but really speaking to such gigantic themes about time and mortality and love and what makes humans satisfied. And so if we think about Our Town as this kind of enduring play, from 1936, I think it was, maybe 38, but that it is something that we should go back to because it is a beautiful piece of literature. And simply the idea that literature is something that is worthwhile and something that endures and something that can tell us a lot about a people. It's knowing like the prime export of a country, or knowing about the Treaty of Versailles, or all of these different things that we have learned in the past really don't tell us as much about a group of people as something like Our Town. So I love this idea in the play itself, and I also love the way that Ann Patchett with Tom Lake is kind of raising up and is kind of resurrecting the importance of Our Town, and also telling us, that this whole story that is very appealing and very contemporary and very compelling for today's readers, that also speaks to some of these same issues. All of these are questions that we have the inklings of, the beginnings of in Our Town, and they're explored so beautifully by Patchett in Tom Lake. I'm going to run very quickly through a few quibbles. Then we're going to talk about strengths, and then we're going to end with just a quotation or two by Thornton Wilder. So in terms of quibbles, at one point she talks about Emily's impossible legs because they're very long. And honestly, I just was relieved that it wasn't impossibly long. As some of you know who've been listening to the Foxed page, the use of the adverb impossibly has become ubiquitous in this kind of certain ilk of literary fiction, and it drives me insane. I cannot think of a single time when it is well used. Like just, impossibly dark or impossibly long or impossibly beautiful. It just doesn't, it drives me insane. So at least she didn't say impossibly blah, blah, blah. She said her impossible legs. And I'm just like, no, nobody's legs are impossible. I mean, I know what people are trying to do here. It just did not work. There also was the time when young Lara is in Los Angeles and they want her, to do a bikini test. Essentially, they're checking out whether or not her body is beautiful enough. And she says, those fuckers wanted to see if I could swim. And then she's like, I'll swim for them or something. But the fuckers part, I was like, okay, this is a little out of voice. Lara does not swear at any other point. And it's not that she didn't have like the chutzpah. It's more just like, I was like, that's out of voice. She's not someone who's going to say, those fuckers want to see me swim, I'll swim. I just didn't, I didn't buy it. And I, of course, love the F word. I'm always a fan of it, but not when it doesn't seem congruent with the character. There were a couple of times where things seemed anachronistic. She's talking in 1988 about, being on this lake at this repertory theater. And she's talking about how, producers are all about spreadsheets. And I was like, I don't think everybody was making spreadsheets in 1988. I could be totally wrong on that, but that seems like a much more modern word. She also at that point talks about the wonkiness of his XL teeth. So she's talking about Peter Duke, which first of all, that I had a hard time with her description, our initial description of Peter Duke. He just wasn't gelling, and everything, all of the different details I was getting were actually seeming creepy and kind of gross. And I was like, wait, are we supposed to like this guy or not like this guy? And that was one of those aspects of description, the wonkiness of his XL teeth. So first of all, the XL teeth, like it was like XL, capital XL, which that seemed a little out of voice. I'm like, XL seems like a very like 21st century kind of thing. And also wonkiness as a word, like if something is wonky and then wonkiness, that seems like that is also a term that has come, into parlance more recently than 1988. And also the wonkiness of his XL teeth, I was like, what are we even supposed to be imagining here? And in fact, this is a good segue into the description that we have of Peter Duke. It begins with this thing where he arrives at her doorstep, and there's a relatively long sort of half-page thing about how she suddenly feels very menaced by him, and he understands that she feels menaced, and he takes a step back out into the hallway, and I was like, wait, what is happening here? I liked her treatment of like Me Too and this idea of men in this industry as really being gross and as having certain expectations about the casting couch. I liked that because she brought it up without it, without it sort of overtaking the whole story. But I was confused here because I was like, wait, is this guy predatory? Like, are we on, high alert here because he's gross? And this is our very first introduction to Peter Duke, which, yes, like in some ways he is a little bit forceful. But I don't think as the reader we're meant to think that he's like super predatory from the start. Then we have this physical description. His eyes were dark and overlarge in his thin face, his black hair long and pushed behind his ears. He stood up suddenly and very straight, the paper still in his hand. He was wearing a linen t-shirt and very long surgical scrub pants. If you invite me in, I'll tell you a story. Which I also was like, ew, creepy. And then, come in then, I said. His ancient espadrilles were dirty and folded at the heels. I'll risk it. And I was like, wait, okay, so we've got scrubs, we've got a long, thin face with giant eyes, we have long black hair that's tucked behind his ears. Like, I'm picturing like Jared Leto in like a very creepy kind of role of some sort. Like, and then the scrubs and the espadrilles, like I kind of get it in retrospect, but even like now that I know Peter Duke a little better and, his brother Sebastian, in his tennis whites and whatnot, it just never quite squared with me, this initial description. So that is one of the quibbles. I mean, it's very difficult as a writer to understand what your reader is viewing versus what you have in your head. Clearly, Anne Patchett had a vision in her head of someone who was handsome and had long dark hair and big teeth, I guess, and was wearing scrubs and espadrilles, and all of that was like very sexy. But as the reader, if you're feeling threatened and our narrator is like feeling like this guy shouldn't enter her room, and then he's like, if you let me in, I'll tell you a story. I mean, there just were a couple of elements here that did not, in fact, work, and in fact, put me on high alert at a time when I should not have been. Then the last thing in terms of quibbles is her family. It just was a little too easy. She explained much later in the book, really when her grandmother is dying, why in fact her family is not close. And she talks about her brother. I think she had a brother, maybe a sister. I mean, I don't even remember because in fact the family was so shadowy. Oh, wait, no, she has 2 older brothers maybe. And then there's like a long gap and then she is born. So you have this idea of her as being, somewhat unwanted and really as growing up in her grandmother's house, which all of that is good. But I felt like the family was dismissed a little bit too easily. Like when she gets married, there's no conversation at all about whether or not she would invite her family to come and see her get married to Joe Nelson. Like the family are just completely not in the story, which is not like the craziest thing ever, but I didn't feel like the explanation was all that sound. And on that same note, toward the end of the book, she talks a lot about how her grandmother would have been like so impressed by her independence and like how her grandmother would not believe that she like got on an airplane and flew to Los Angeles and lived by herself and, told those fuckers that she could swim and all that stuff that went down in Los Angeles. But as the reader, you're like, wait, all of that stuff happened. And I was just kind of like, okay, I guess she's a very independent person. And you're a little curious how she got so independent from like this tiny town in New Hampshire, but you just go along with it. It's jarring later to feel like that her grandmother would have been so shocked by all of this. So there was some disconnect. Part of me wondered if maybe Ann Patchett had written certain chunks of this at the end of the book, had written those chunks first about the grandmother, and then, had feathered them in at some later date. It felt just like a little bit like it wasn't all hanging together. And in fact, that the family, it was a little convenient that they were really not part of the story. Okay, so before we do a couple of quick Thornton Wilder quotes, I want to just talk about some of the strengths of the book because, in fact, the strengths definitely overwhelmed my tiny quibbles. So just very briefly, I thought her reference to COVID was so graceful, and I think it was so well done. It was really evocative. She's sewing masks for the farm stand. It's like this kind of very subtle kind of background thing that I really appreciated. I liked the way that it would have put them all together. I liked it as kind of a plot device in many ways, but it wasn't sort of too focused just on the experience of COVID. I really liked the rounded relatability of the characters, especially our narrator, Laura, and especially Joe Nelson. I just thought, I don't even know exactly how she did it, but Joe Nelson, her husband, just comes across as just an absolute gem, which, what a weird word. I sound like her grandmother or something. But I really appreciated it. And again, it felt like this kind of sweet, quiet story, but the weight and how much I was invested in both Laura and her husband and her family was really, it was very compelling to me. I also liked the fact that in kind of a quiet book and kind of a sweet book, we actually have quite a few kind of twists and turns. Kind of a lot happens, not so much in the sort of contemporary story where they're picking their cherries, although we have some subplots there that are very rich and very interesting. But in the backstory, a lot is going on. This is someone who is, having a very successful acting career out of a tiny town in New Hampshire. And the tale of all of that and, all of the details about how the theater works, all of that was very compelling. I also really liked, she had some excellent figurative language. One of them, there was a time when the girls were all braiding their hair together. There were a bunch of times when braiding came up, and it was very compelling. I made some notes about figurative language. We do not have time to get into it, but some of her metaphors and symbolism were really very beautiful. The last thing I will say is that she really deftly pulled off this idea of this love story that I thought was going to be, perhaps like a little mawkish and a little bit saccharine, but it really worked well because, in fact, things get very heavy toward the end. Laura, has this really gut-wrenching experience with Peter. I won't spoil it for all of you if you haven't quite finished the book, but there is a whole thing about women's reproductive rights that I found very compelling. There's just a lot of twists and turns at the end where things really did, much like they do in Our Town, the play, things really did get very compelling in a very sad way that really spoke to the weight of the novel in really excellent ways. Okay, the last thing we're going to do to close today is to take a look at 2 quotations by Thornton Wilder. These quotations come from the introduction of my copy of Our Town. It is, who makes this? It's a Signet Classics. It has this beautiful moon on the cover. It's really quite a lovely. Actually, there's a lot of information about the play and a bunch of cool photographs in the end if you're looking for a good edition of the play. So in the foreword by this professor, by Donald Margulies, We have him quoting this very beautiful passage that Thornton Wilder wrote. The response we make when we believe a work of the imagination is that of saying, "This is the way things are. I have always known it without being fully aware that I knew it. Now, in the presence of this play or novel or poem or picture or piece of music, I know that I know it." It's so beautiful. It's such a generous idea. And then right across on page 11 of the foreword, we have Donald Margulies. He is defending essentially the play that, he thinks is disregarded because, in fact, it's very simple. He's someone, I think he teaches theater at Yale. He's someone who clearly is feeling like Our Town is like really basic and not innovative enough and like not that spectacular. But as someone who's not like a huge theater goer, I think of it as a really beautiful play. In fact, it's coming back to Broadway. I'm dying to see whatever this new representation of it is going to be. So Donald Margulies says the following: "Our Town is anything but dated. It is timeless. It is simple, but also profound. It is full of genuine sentiment, which is not the same as its being sentimental. And as far as its being uneventful, well, the event of the play is huge. It's life itself." It's so beautiful. And I might just reread that beautiful quotation by Thornton Wilder in order to close, just because I think it is so compelling and really speaks to why we should all be reading more. Frankly, get out there, read more, people. I'm going to leave you with these words of Thornton Wilder again. The response we make when we believe a work of the imagination is that of saying, "This is the way things are. I have always known it without being fully aware that I knew it. Now, in the presence of this play or novel or poem or picture or piece of music, I know that I know it." So beautiful. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really loved Tom Lake, and I really loved the excuse to go back and look at Our Town. I hope that this helped you appreciate both, and I hope you come back soon. Happy reading.